The first thing I remember is the sound of his laugh echoing off the wood paneling, too loud for a room where people's lives were being sliced up like pie charts. Courtroom 4B smelled like paper and old coffee and nerves. I sat there at the defendant's table, plain white blouse, thrift store slacks, hair pulled back tight because my hands were shaking too much to do anything fancy, and tried not to stare at the man I'd once promised forever to. He was over there at the petitioner's table in a navy suit that probably cost more than my car, leaning back like he was at a business lunch instead of the hearing that would decide where our kids slept and how we both lived for the next 20 years. His lawyer sat beside him, all polished shoes and smugness, flipping through a binder thick with tabs that, according to them, proved I didn't deserve anything. Case number 23-472, Carter versus Carter, the clerk called. The judge glanced down at the file, then up at us. Appearances. Husband's attorney stood smoothly. "Good morning, Your Honor. Robert Fields for the petitioner, Mr. David Carter." He sat, and the judge's eyes shifted to me. This was the part I'd rehearsed 100 times in the mirror and still wasn't ready for. My mouth went dry. "And for the respondent," the judge prompted. I stood up, feeling every eye on my brown skin, my off-the-rack blouse, the fact that there was no one in a suit beside me. I could feel the other women on the benches holding their breath, that mix of pity and rather you than me rolling off them. "Your Honor," I said, praying my voice wouldn't crack, "I'll be representing myself." For a heartbeat, the room went completely silent. Then I heard it, that little puff of amusement from my ex-husband's side of the room, the snort he makes when the waiter mispronounces wine he thinks only he knows. He turned to his attorney and said, not nearly as quietly as he thought, "Told you, she couldn't get anyone to take her case. This is gonna be easy." His lawyer chuckled, lips twitching. That laugh hit me harder than any insult he'd thrown across our itching table. It was the pure sound of underestimation. I've heard versions of it my whole life, when guidance counselors heard me say pre-law instead of practical major, when customers found out the black girl behind the desk was the manager, not the assistant, when my own husband told me, "You wouldn't last 5 minutes in one of my meetings, baby. You're too emotional." Have you ever walked into a room where everyone has already decided you're going to lose, and the only person who hasn't agreed to that yet is you? The judge peered over his glasses. "Miss Carter, you understand the risks of proceeding pro se?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. At least, I thought I did. I understood I had no money left for a lawyer because the man sitting across from me had quietly drained our accounts into things with names I didn't recognize. I understood that legal aid was so swamped they could give me a pamphlet and a pat on the back, but not sit beside me. I understood that the one decent attorney I'd met had looked at our so-called prenup and shook his head, said, "Unless you can prove fraud, this is an uphill battle." What I also understood, more clearly than anything else, was that for 15 years I let this man talk over me in every room that mattered. Not today. "Very well," the judge said. "Mr. Fields, you may proceed with your opening. Then we'll hear from Miss Carter." Fields stood and did his polished thing, called my husband a devoted provider, painted me as financially irresponsible, unwilling to honor the parties' prenuptial agreement. I could feel people in the gallery nodding along. They'd seen this show before. Successful man, ungrateful wife, messy divorce. When he sat down, confident, the judge turned to me. "Miss Carter," he said. My knees tried to lock. For a second, the only sound I heard was my own heartbeat in my ears. I thought about every night I'd spend hunched over my kitchen table with case law printouts and highlighters, the words blurring as the kids slept down the hall. I thought about the girl I used to be, sitting in the front row of debate class, feeling electric when I argued a point and saw someone someone's face change. I thought about my mother standing in court years ago with no idea what was happening as my father's lawyer carved her life in half with words she didn't understand. I wasn't going to be her if I could help it. I stood up, smoothed my blouse with hands that only shook a little now, and picked up the worn blue folder I'd brought. Your Honor, I began, and this time my voice came out steadier, stronger. Before we talk about support or property division, I'd like to address the validity of the document my husband keeps hiding behind. The prenuptial agreement Mr. Fields referred to is in fact forged and was never properly executed under Georgia law. The word forged dropped into the wood-paneled room like a stone in still water. You could actually hear the reaction, sharp inhales from the back row, a muffled "what?" from somewhere near the aisle. My husband's smile froze on his face. His lawyer's pen stopped mid-tap. The judge's eyebrows climbed a notch. "That is a serious allegation, Miss Carter," he said slowly. "Do you have evidence to support it?" I opened the folder to the first tab I'd marked in neon pink, slid a stack of copies on the table, and walked one to the bailiff to pass up to the bench. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I have multiple pieces of evidence, including email correspondence from my husband's uncle, an attorney, pressuring me to sign without independent counsel, a version history from his own computer showing changes made to the agreement after I signed, and travel records proving I was not even in the state on the date the notary stamp says I was." There was a murmur so loud the judge had to bang his gavel. "Silence in the court," he warned, but his tone with me had shifted. There was no indulgent edge now, just wary interest. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband's eyes go wide, his face flushing a color I'd only ever seen in private. His little laugh was gone. For the first time since we walked into that room, he looked like the one who didn't understand what was happening. The whole court had expected a broken, bitter woman to sob about how unfair life was. Instead, I'd spoken the one language this system couldn't ignore: receipts. People in that courtroom saw a black woman with a worn folder and no lawyer and thought they knew exactly who I was. Another stay-at-home wife trying to cash out. You could see it on their faces. What they didn't know was that once upon a time, I used to sit where the law students sit, in the back of courtrooms, taking notes on procedure for a class I thought was just the beginning. I didn't set out in life to be just somebody's wife. I was supposed to be the one standing where that smug man in the Navy suit stood, speaking Latin words that made judges listen. When I was a little girl, my mother worked at the courthouse as a cleaner. Sometimes when she had no choice but to bring me, she'd sit me on a bench with crayons and a sandwich while she emptied trash from offices with plaques on the doors, "Attorney at Law." I peek in and see shelves of books, women and men in nice clothes, voices lowered but carrying weight. I remember watching a black woman lawyer once, the way she walked up to the bench, braids pulled back, suit sharp, voice polite but unshakable as she argued some motion. The white man she was up against kept interrupting her, and the judge shut him down and let her finish. I went home that night, and when my mother told me to pick a book for bedtime, I dragged out an old, torn dictionary. "What you want with that dusty thing?" she laughed. "I'm going to learn all the big words," I said. "I'm going to talk like that lady in court so nobody can tell me to hush." By the time I hit high school, pre-law was my answer to everything. Teachers asked my plans. Law school. Friends joked about me arguing over the lunch bill. "You should be a lawyer," they said. I took debate, mock trial, anything that let me put words in order and see them land. I got into a good state college on a partial scholarship and 3 part-time jobs. I was the first one in my family to set foot on a campus with dorms, and I walked around that place like every brick had my name etched under it. Then life did what life does to black girls who think determination is enough. My mother got sick, the kind of sick where it's just tiredness turned into you have 6 months before any of us could catch up. I tried to do it all. Classes, caretaking, shifts at the campus bookstore, but there are only so many hours in a day. Bills stacked up, financial aid shrank when my grades dipped. One meeting with the bursar's office, one sentence. If you can't pay by the end of the semester, you'll have to withdraw. And just like that, the track I've been running on since I was 10 ended in a hard blank wall. I came home. I took whatever work I could find. Receptionist for a tire shop, night manager at a call center, temp at a medical office. The LSAT prep books I bought with my first tax refund sat on a shelf, collecting dust. You can always go back, people said, but every year, back got further away, buried under overtime and grief. I met David at the clinic. He came in one day with a hurt wrist from playing pickup ball with the guys and left with my number, a prescription, and a plan. He was handsome, charming in that way men are who know they look good in any room. More than that, he listened. When he found out I'd once wanted to be an attorney, he didn't laugh. He said, I always told myself I'd marry a woman with a brain. There's nothing more attractive than that. When we started dating, he'd introduce me to his colleagues, men in suits that smelled like money and thought Atlanta existed only in Buckhead and boardrooms, and brag she wanted to be an attorney, smartest woman I know. I ate it up. It felt like a balm on a bruise I pretended no one could see. When he got promoted at his firm, we celebrated with cheap champagne on my mama's old porch. He talked about wanting a partner, about building something together. You can still go back to school, he said, eyes bright. Once we're stable, I've got you now. You won't have to struggle like you did. That once dangled in front of me like a carrot. Then came the ring. The proposal was big. Restaurant, friends, a photographer hiding in a corner. I said yes with my whole chest. A week later, he showed up with a folder. Just one thing, he said, sliding it across my tiny kitchen table. My uncle is a lawyer. He drew this up. It's standard. I looked at the document. Prenuptial agreement was the bold title at the top. I felt my stomach wobble, but told myself not to be silly. Standard for who? I asked. For anyone who owns a business. He said, babe, you know I've been working on this thing for years. The partners are particular. They need to know if, God forbid, anything happens, I'm not going to lose the company in a divorce settlement. Divorce? I flinched. We just got engaged. We're already talking about divorce? He laughed, squeezed my hand. You know that's not what this is. Look, it basically says what we've already agreed on. What's yours is yours. What's mine is mine. We don't go after each other. It protects both of us. So we get separate lawyers to look it over? I said, running my fingers over the dense paragraphs. I'll find somebody from legal aid. Make sure I understand everything. The way his smile twitched should have told me everything. There's no time for all that, he said smoothly. The venue's booked. Deposits are down. You want to push the wedding back just so some stranger can tell you what I'm already telling you? My uncle did this pro bono. He's not going to cheat you. My mother was excited about the wedding. My friends were sending me Pinterest boards and asking about dates. I was working double shifts to pay off my last lingering medical bill from her. The idea of being difficult, of being that woman who almost blew everything up over paperwork sat heavy on my chest. So I read it once. I didn't fully grasp all the language about marital property and separate assets, but I saw the clause about waiving rights to any increase in his business value. I saw the bit about limiting spousal support to a fraction of his income for a set number of years. Is this normal? I asked, the old pre-law student in me still alive enough to be wary. Babe, he said, looking almost hurt, do you trust me or not? That question hit the one place he knew I was weakest. I spent my life being the strong one, the practical one. I wanted just once to lean. So I signed. No independent counsel, no negotiation, just a line with my name on it under a date his uncle's secretary chose. "You're doing the right thing," his uncle said, clapping me on the back like I joined a club, not giving up leverage I barely understood. "You're marrying up. This keeps things clean." After the wedding, life sped up. Babies came as they do. The baby weight never quite left my hips, but the responsibility sat heavier on my shoulders than any number the scale could show. I left the temp jobs to stay home when childcare costs made no sense. My days shifted from spreadsheets and intake forms to bottles and laundry and PTA meetings. David's business grew. He went from being one partner among many to the face of a division with his name on glossy brochures and magazine profiles. His suits got nicer, our house got bigger. The jokes started small. "You used to be the smart one," he'd say with a grin when I burned dinner. "What happened?" "I married you," I'd shoot back, trying to keep it light. Sometimes he'd let it be a joke. Other times his eyes would harden just a fraction. When I asked about bank accounts, he'd wave me off. "It's all automated," he'd say. "I got it handled. You'd be bored by the details." If I pressed, he'd remind me of the prenup. Even if we split, he'd say, "You know the deal. Business stays with me. You get what we agreed. That's why we signed that thing." Over time, I stopped asking, not because I didn't care, but because every question turned into a conversation about how much he did and how little I contributed financially. "You think diapers pay for themselves?" I snapped once. "You think these kids raise themselves?" He sighed. "We both have our roles. Yours is not about money. That's not a bad thing. You wanted to be home. Don't resent me for doing what I have to do." Somewhere along the way, the girl who used to argue points in mock trial learned to pick her battles differently. Instead of case law, I knew which teacher needed cookies on conference day to go easy on my son. I knew the exact tone to use with certain doctors so they actually heard me. I knew how to stretch one income without making it obvious that things were tighter than they looked. I poured all my skills into a life that didn't come with a paycheck or a title. Which is why when I caught a glimpse of bank statements tucked half out of his briefcase, numbers bigger than anything we'd ever budgeted for, and saw charges at hotels I'd never been to, my first instinct wasn't, "Gotcha." It was, "What else don't I know?" When I confronted him about the first suspicious transaction, he laughed. "You really going through my stuff like some detective?" he said. "It was a business trip. You want receipts for every steak I buy a client?" "I want to know who Melanie is," I replied, holding up the line item that literally read, "Dinner with Mel Del Frisco's." His face changed. "You're crazy," he snapped. "That's my assistant. You met her." I hadn't. When I asked again, the conversation ended with him jabbing a finger at the prenup stored in our safe. "We agreed how this goes," he said. "You don't get to flip the script now because you've been watching too many divorce shows. You leave, you walk with what we agreed. I don't owe you more just because you're suddenly feeling underappreciated." That's when the words, "you'd get nothing," started dripping into arguments. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, he'd remind me of the document I'd signed in a haze of love and pressure. And every time he did, a little more of that law school girl died inside. Until she didn't. Until one day, when I was cleaning out an old box from the hall closet and found the original prenup copy tucked inside. And something about the dates on the last page didn't sit right. The signatures looked off. The notary stamp said we'd signed on a Tuesday in New York. I remembered that Tuesday very clearly. I'd been in Atlanta, working a double at the clinic before driving to my mother's to help her with her blood pressure meds. I held that paper in my hand and thought, you study enough law, even half finished, and some lines start to jump out at you. That was the moment the old me, the one who knew what consideration and disclosure meant beyond TV dramas, woke up. The moment the story shifted from he'll leave you with nothing to we'll see about that. When I noticed that date on the prenup didn't line up with my own memory, I couldn't unsee it. It was like when you notice one tile is crooked on the floor, suddenly the whole pattern looks off. I pulled out old calendars, dug through the shoebox of receipts and appointment cards I'd kept, because that's what broke girls who turn into careful women do. We keep proof. There it was. A dentist appointment card stamped for that Tuesday in Atlanta, a time-off slip from my job at the clinic, a text to my best friend complaining about Atlanta traffic. All on the day that piece of paper claimed I was signing away my future in a New York law office. I sat at the kitchen table with the prenup spread out in front of me, kids' cereal bowls pushed to the side, and felt this slow, cold anger drip through my veins. Not the hot kind that makes you throw things, the kind that makes you sit very, very still, because if you move too fast, you'll shatter. Up until then, the fight between us had been emotional. Who cared more? Who sacrificed more? Who was tired more? Now I saw there was another fight I hadn't even known we were in. Him versus the truth on paper. The same man who laughed at the idea of me reading legal stuff had been quite comfortable signing my name to things when I wasn't looking. I didn't say anything right away. I did what I'd always done when backed into a corner. I went looking for information. Legal Aid had a clinic on Thursdays. I took off my ring, put on my best blazer, and sat in a room full of other women with folders in their laps and the same hollow look in their eyes. The attorney I saw couldn't represent me. Too many people, not enough staff, but she could give me 30 minutes and a checklist. I slid the prenup across the table and told her, he keeps waving this in my face like it's the Bible. I need to know if it actually says what he thinks it says. She read in silence for a few minutes, lips pursing. Did you have your own lawyer when you signed this? She asked. No, I said. His uncle drafted it. I just signed. Did you get a full list of his assets at the time? Bank accounts, business valuations? He said that was for the accountants, I replied. I saw what he chose to show me. She sighed. Georgia will generally uphold a prenup if it meets certain criteria. Full disclosure, no fraud, no duress, independent counsel preferred, she said. On his face, this one gives him a lot of protection. But if those dates are wrong, if you can prove you weren't where this says you were, if there were changes after you signed, she tapped the page, that's where you have something to work with. It's not a slam dunk, but it's not as ironclad as he thinks. I asked what hiring her would cost. She gave me a number that might as well have been written in another language. She said, we can't take full representation. We barely keep the lights on as is. I wish I had better news. I went to 3 private attorneys after that, paying consultation fees with a credit card I'd always promised myself I wouldn't max out. They all said versions of the same thing. You have a case if you can prove fraud or non-disclosure, but forensic accounting is expensive. Litigating a prenup is expensive. Your husband has resources and a head start. Without a retainer of X, I can't go to war with a firm like his. Each X was higher than anything I could scrape together without selling my car or the kids' college funds, which, by the way, I now suspected weren't as flush as he'd always claimed. Meanwhile, David was moving like a man with all the time and money in the world. He had filed the divorce petition before I'd even wrapped my head around the idea that we were really over, painting himself as the reasonable one. Irreconcilable differences, the paperwork said, like that covered the gap between I married you for love and I forged your signature on the document to make sure you never see a dime of what we built. He came to me with an offer through his lawyer, a modest lump sum, some temporary child support, me keeping the minivan and what was left in a joint account he'd already drained twice. "This is generous," he said, standing in my doorway like a man bestowing gifts. "You could drag this out and end up with less. The prenup is clear. I don't want to see you struggle, but I'm not going to let you ruin me out of spite." Spite, I echoed. "Is that what we're calling wanting a fair share of the life I spent 15 years maintaining?" He shrugged. "You chose to stay home. You knew the deal. You think any court is going to treat your housework like equal value to what I've built? They'll look at the contract. They'll look at the numbers. I've talked to my attorneys. Unless you find some magic loophole, you walk with basically what I'm offering, or less." That was the main conflict in a nutshell. His confidence in a system he thought he'd gamed, and my growing realization that the only way to beat that confidence was to understand that system well enough to turn it against him. At night, after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge, I'd spread papers out on the table like my mother used to spread bills. Only this time, I wasn't just counting what I owed. I was counting what had been hidden. Bank statements I could still access showed money moving in ways that made no sense for household expenses. Wire transfers to LLCs with names I never heard of during our marriage. Mysterious debits labeled consultant that matched up with weekends he claimed to be at conferences. I'd print everything I could get my hands on, highlighting patterns, attaching sticky notes. Why didn't he tell me about this? Where did this go? On bad nights, the voice in my head told me it was pointless. It whispered, "You're outgunned. They've got a whole team. You've got Wikipedia and an out-of-date library card." Another voice, quieter but more stubborn, pushed back. "You've carried this family on less sleep and less money than this. You're not dumb. You were reading case summaries while he was still figuring out Excel. The only reason he's so sure you can't do this is because it's worked in his favor for years for you to believe it." The kids picked up on the tension. My oldest would ask, "Mom, are we going to have to move?" My youngest would cling a little tighter at bedtime. David took every opportunity to paint himself as the victim. "You see what your mom is doing? Trying to take everything from daddy. I'm trying to be fair, but she wants more, more, more." That, more than any lawyer's letter, lit the fuse in me. I had swallowed my pride 1,000 times for the sake of peace. I had bitten my tongue through condescension and cheating and 100 micro disrespect moments in front of our children because I thought keeping the family together was the highest good. The day I heard my son ask, "Mom, why are you being so mean to Dad?" based on nothing but his father's framing, something in me snapped back into place that had been bent out of shape for a decade. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the story my children were going to grow up believing, that their father was the builder and I was the hanger-on, that I should be grateful for crumbs because there was a piece of paper with my signature on it. It was about whether my daughter would one day sign something she didn't understand because a man she loved said, "Trust me." The main conflict had two fronts now. One was in court. Prenup versus fraud, assets versus disclosure. The other was in my own head. The girl who dropped out of pre-law because life demanded it versus the woman who let a man convince her brain was only good for grocery lists and school forms. Every time I looked at that prenup, at the neat black ink of my name next to terms I didn't fully grasp, I heard his voice. "You wouldn't last 5 minutes in court."
Every time I looked at my children, I heard another voice. What will you tell them you did when someone tried to write you out of your own life? That's what kept me at the table when my eyes burned and my back ached. That's what made me say no when his lawyer sent a last final offer with a deadline meant to scare me. Signed by Friday or we pursue fees from you, it read. I circled those words, taped the letter above my coffee maker, and every morning as the kettle boiled, I looked at it and muttered, "We'll see who pays whose fees."
The night it really shifted, I was sitting at that same scarred kitchen table, pages spread out everywhere, when my laptop battery died. The screen went black mid-sentence on an article about unconscionable prenuptial agreements. And for a second, the silence in the room felt like a verdict. No lawyer, no money, 2 kids asleep down the hall, and a man with a full firm behind him, ready to gut me on paper. I put my head down on my arms, and for the first time since I'd found that forged date, I let myself cry like a child. Not the quiet tears you hide in the shower, the ugly shaking kind you can't talk through. In my head, I heard every voice that had ever told me I was aiming too high. The college advisor who raised an eyebrow at pre-law and said, maybe you should pick something more realistic. The uncle who'd joked, you talk too much to keep a man. Better hope you get a job that pays. David standing in the kitchen once with a beer in his hand, laughing. You get eaten alive in a courtroom, babe. You cry at dog movies. I don't know how long I stayed like that, cheek pressed to the cool faux wood surface, but eventually the tears ran out. What was left underneath surprised me. It wasn't hopelessness. It was a kind of stubborn, bitter anger at myself. Not for trusting him once, that's human. For believing for so many years that one closed door 20 years ago meant I had to keep my mouth shut in every room after that. I sat up, wiped my face on my sleeve, and said out loud to the empty kitchen, you didn't drop out because you were dumb. You dropped out because your mama was dying. Saying it like that, plain and bald, shifted something in me. I've been carrying that exit from school like proof I wasn't cut out for certain things. In reality, it was proof of how much I'd been asked to carry at once. I opened the laptop again, plugged it in, and instead of envying the women whose names were on the cases I was reading, I started asking a different question. What exactly did they do? Break it down. Motion filed, exhibits introduced, cross-examination. It stopped feeling like magic and started feeling like steps. Hard steps, but steps. The next day, I went back to the legal aid clinic. I can't hire you, I told the same tired attorney. But can you show me where to look? How to organize this? What a motion to set aside a prenup even looks like? She studied me for a long moment, probably weighing my sanity against her own exhaustion. Then she pushed a thick, dog-eared manual across the table, Georgia Domestic Relations. She said, I can't give you legal advice, she repeated, the disclaimer she had to say. Then she tapped a section. But if I were in your shoes, I'd read this chapter first, and this one, and this. She wrote down case names on a sticky note, slid it over. She said, look for fact patterns like yours. Pay attention to what the courts cared about. I spent the next month living a double life. By day, I was still mom, packing lunches, signing homework planners, showing up at school plays. By night, after tucking them in, I became a one-woman research committee. The public library became my second home. The security guard started greeting me by name, nodding toward my table. I spread my materials out, prenup copy, printouts of emails, case law summaries, highlighters bleeding through cheap paper. I watched self-help legal videos online, took notes on how to organize exhibits, how to address the judge without sounding combative. I practiced saying, "Your Honor," in the mirror until it stopped sounding foreign in my mouth. Every time I hit a concept I didn't understand, I'd write it down and take it back to the clinic. Explain this part. What does fiduciary duty really mean in marriage? How much disclosure is full under Georgia law? The attorney didn't have time for hand-holding, but she respected hustle. She circled things, scribbled, "Read X versus Y" in the margin. Remind me, remember, the judge is a human being before he is a robe. Tell a story with facts, not feelings. Meanwhile, David's side was ramping up. His lawyer filed a motion to enforce the prenup early, essentially asking the court to decide before trial that it was valid and binding. The motion read like a character assassination dressed in legalese. I was willfully unemployed, benefited from a luxurious lifestyle she did not contribute to, executed the agreement willingly and with full knowledge. On the last page, that was in black and white. Any challenge to this agreement is frivolous and should result in an award of attorney's fees to the petitioner. Translation: if you even try to argue this, we will make you pay for the privilege of losing. The hearing date on that motion was circled in my kitchen calendar in red. That was the day everything would turn, one way or the other. One evening, about 2 weeks before the hearing, my oldest came into the kitchen as I was packing my bag with yet another stack of cases. "You going to the library again?" he asked. I nodded. "Why can't you just let the lawyers handle it?" he said, genuine confusion in his teenage face. "Dad said you're just making things worse." I put the bag down, leaned against the counter, and looked at him. "You ever study for a test?" He rolled his eyes. "Duh." "And do you go into the test hoping someone else did your studying for you?" He shook his head. "No. That's what this is. A big, ugly test about my life. David hired very good teachers. I couldn't pay any, so I'm teaching myself. I might still get some questions wrong, but I'd rather walk in there knowing I tried than sign whatever they hand me and regret it every day for the next 20 years. He didn't say anything for a while. Then quietly he asked, "Are you scared?" I admitted, terrified. But scared and unprepared is worse than scared and ready. After he went to his room, I stood there alone and realized that was my turning point boiled down. The fear wasn't going anywhere. The question was what I was going to do with it. A week before the hearing, I met one last private attorney, a woman this time, black, maybe 10 years older than me. I scraped together enough for her consult because I wanted to know from someone who'd done what I was about to try whether I was walking into the lion's den with a stake around my neck. I laid out my evidence. She read in silence, then looked up. "You've done good work." She said, "You have more organized here than some junior associates I've supervised." "But," I prompted, bracing. "But trial is a minefield. They will try to rattle you. They will object, talk over you, make you feel small. Representing yourself is like performing surgery on your own body. I can't in good conscience tell you it's lies." "I can't afford you," I said bluntly. "And he's already conflicted out every mid-sized firm in town. Even if I had the money, finding someone with the time and no conflict would be a miracle." She sighed. "Then my advice is this.
Narrow your focus. Don't try to fight every battle. Go after the most obvious weaknesses, the date issue, the lack of counsel, the changes after signature, the undisclosed accounts. Be concise. Judges hate rambling. Bring paper copies of everything in triplicate. And remember, you are not there to win his approval or the gallery's applause. You are there to give the judge a reason, any reason, grounded in law, to say, this needs a closer look. That's it. As I stood to leave, she added, and if after this hearing the court invalidates the prenup or orders a forensic accounting, call me. If your financial position changes, I'd be interested in taking this on fully. That was the first time a lawyer spoke to me like a potential ally instead of a problem. Walking back to my car, clutching that business card, I thought, they don't all think I'm crazy. Some of them see the same thing in these papers I do. That night, I sat at the table and rewrote my arguments from scratch. No long speeches about my sacrifices, just bullet points. Prenup executed without independent counsel. Evidence, email chain, Exhibit A. Notary location and date impossible.
Evidence, travel records, Exhibit B, C. Document modified post-signature. Evidence, metadata from husband's computer, Exhibit D. Failure to disclose assets. Evidence, bank statements E through L. I rehearsed out loud until my children complained from their rooms. "We can hear you, Mom!" I turned it into a game with them, having them sit on the couch and object like TV lawyers while I practiced not losing my temper. Every time my son interrupted me, I'd smile and say, "Objection, relevance," and keep going. By the morning of the hearing, I was exhausted and wired, but something had settled in me too. I wasn't the law student. I wasn't a licensed attorney, but I was also no longer the woman who flinched every time David said the word prenup like he was invoking a curse. The turning point, truly, was internal. I stopped seeing myself as someone begging the court for mercy and started seeing myself as someone presenting a case. An imperfect one, sure, but a case. When I walked into that courtroom alone, clutching my worn blue folder, my stomach still flipped. When David laughed at the phrase, "I'll be representing myself," a part of me still wanted to run. But beneath the fear was another feeling I hadn't expected, a thin, bright thread of defiance. The same spark I'd felt at 16 in a mock trial classroom when I'd made an argument and watched the teacher's brow lift in reluctant respect. As I stood up and opened my folder, that girl and this tired woman lined up for the first time in years. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting him be the only voice that counted in rooms where my life was being decided. When my case was finally called that morning, my palms were so damp I was afraid the papers would slide right out of my hands. I wiped them on my skirt, stood up when the clerk called Carter versus Carter, and tried to ignore the way David was half smirking, half scrolling his phone like this was just another item on his busy schedule. His lawyer, Fields, stood when the judge walked in, that easy confidence radiating off him. He'd done this 100 times. I'd never done it once. Good morning, the judge said, settling into his chair. We're here on petitioner's motion to enforce the prenuptial agreement and for temporary orders. Mr. Fields? Fields launched right into it. Your Honor, as we've outlined in our brief, the parties executed a valid, enforceable prenuptial agreement prior to their marriage. My client has abided by its terms for the entirety of this union. The respondent has benefited from a generous lifestyle she did not contribute to financially. We ask that the court uphold the agreement and deny any attempt to relitigate what was settled over 15 years ago. He spoke for 10 minutes straight, all pursuant to and as contemplated by, painting a picture of a careful, responsible man and a reckless, grasping woman. I watched the judge's face, the way his eyes moved over the motion in front of him, the occasional nod. I could almost hear a gavel clanging in my future if I didn't open my mouth. When Fields finally sat, he did it with a little flourish, like he just landed a dismount. The judge turned to me. Miss Carter, you filed a response opposing enforcement. Yes, Your Honor, I said, standing. My voice didn't shake quite as much as it had when I first announced I'd represent myself. May I approach? He nodded. My legs felt like they had sand in them as I walked to the bench and handed up sets of documents, one for him, one for Fields. I'd flagged the important parts in different colors, just like I'd practiced. Your Honor, I began, turning back to face him and the room. I am asking the court not to enforce the prenuptial agreement for 3 main reasons. First, I had no independent counsel and was discouraged from obtaining any. Second, I was not provided full disclosure of my husband's assets at the time. And third, I paused, let my eyes slide to David, then back to the judge. The document that's been submitted to this court is not the same document I signed. A low murmur rolled through the gallery. The judge held up a hand. That last one sounds like an allegation of fraud, Miss Carter, he said carefully. That is not something the court takes lightly. Tell me what you mean. This is Exhibit A, I said, pointing to the top copy. It's an email from my husband's uncle who drafted the agreement telling me to sign and send back ASAP so we don't delay the wedding. I read the line out loud. No need to waste money on another lawyer when you'll be sharing finances anyway. Fields was on his feet in a heartbeat. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. It's an email from your client's own relative attempting to dissuade my client from seeking independent representation, the judge said, peering at the paper. Overruled for purposes of this motion. Continue, Miss Carter. Exhibit B, I went on, my confidence stitching itself together with each word, is a copy of the prenuptial agreement as I received it, dated March 3rd, and signed by me on March 5th. The notary stamp on the version submitted by petitioner is dated March 7th in New York. I pulled another sheet from my folder. Exhibit C is my time off slip from my employer in Atlanta for March 5th. Exhibit D is my mother's medical record showing she was admitted to Grady Hospital that same week, which is where I was with her. And Exhibit E is my passport showing no travel to New York in that period. I looked up at the judge. Your Honor, I am asking the court not to enforce the prenuptial agreement for 3 main reasons. First, I had no independent counsel and was discouraged from obtaining any. Second, I was not provided full disclosure of my husband's assets at the time. And third, I paused, let my eyes slide to David, then back to the judge. The document that's been submitted to this court is not the same document I signed. The judge held up a hand. That sounds like an allegation of fraud, Miss Carter, he said carefully. That is not something the court takes lightly. Tell me what you mean. This is Exhibit A, I said, pointing to the top copy. It's an email from my husband's uncle who drafted the agreement telling me to sign and send back ASAP so we don't delay the wedding. I read the line out loud. No need to waste money on another lawyer when you'll be sharing finances anyway. Fields was on his feet in a heartbeat. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. It's an email from your client's own relative attempting to dissuade my client from seeking independent representation, the judge said, peering at the paper. Overruled for purposes of this motion. Continue, Miss Carter. Exhibit B, I went on, my confidence stitching itself together with each word, is a copy of the prenuptial agreement as I received it, dated March 3rd and signed by me on March 5th. The notary stamp on the version submitted by petitioner is dated March 7th in New York. I pulled another sheet from my folder. Exhibit C is my time off slip from my employer in Atlanta for March 5th. Exhibit D is my mother's medical record showing she was admitted to Grady Hospital that same week, which is where I was with her. And Exhibit E is my passport showing no travel to New York in that period. I looked up at the judge. Your Honor, I am asking the court not to enforce the prenuptial agreement for three main reasons. First, I had no independent counsel and was discouraged from obtaining any. Second, I was not provided full disclosure of my husband's assets at the time. And third, I paused, let my eyes slide to David, then back to the judge. The document that's been submitted to this court is not the same document I signed. The judge held up a hand. That last one sounds like an allegation of fraud, Miss Carter, he said carefully. That is not something the court takes lightly. Tell me what you mean. This is Exhibit A, I said, pointing to the top copy. It's an email from my husband's uncle who drafted the agreement telling me to sign and send back ASAP so we don't delay the wedding. I read the line out loud. No need to waste money on another lawyer when you'll be sharing finances anyway. Fields was on his feet in a heartbeat. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. It's an email from your client's own relative attempting to dissuade my client from seeking independent representation, the judge said, peering at the paper. Overruled for purposes of this motion. Continue, Miss Carter. Exhibit B, I went on, my confidence stitching itself together with each word, is a copy of the prenuptial agreement as I received it, dated March 3rd and signed by me on March 5th. The notary stamp on the version submitted by petitioner is dated March 7th in New York. I pulled another sheet from my folder. Exhibit C is my time off slip from my employer in Atlanta for March 5th. Exhibit D is my mother's medical record showing she was admitted to Grady Hospital that same week, which is where I was with her. And Exhibit E is my passport showing no travel to New York in that period. I looked up at the judge. Your Honor, I am asking the court not to enforce the prenuptial agreement for three main reasons. First, I had no independent counsel and was discouraged from obtaining any. Second, I was not provided full disclosure of my husband's assets at the time. And third, I paused, let my eyes slide to David, then back to the judge. The document that's been submitted to this court is not the same document I signed. The judge held up a hand. That sounds like an allegation of fraud, Miss Carter, he said carefully. That is not something the court takes lightly. Tell me what you mean. This is Exhibit A, I said, pointing to the top copy. It's an email from my husband's uncle who drafted the agreement telling me to sign and send back ASAP so we don't delay the wedding. I read the line out loud. No need to waste money on another lawyer when you'll be sharing finances anyway.
Fields was on his feet in a heartbeat. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. It's an email from your client's own relative attempting to dissuade my client from seeking independent representation, the judge said, peering at the paper. Overruled for purposes of this motion. Continue, Miss Carter. Exhibit B, I went on, my confidence stitching itself together with each word, is a copy of the prenuptial agreement as I received it, dated March 3rd and signed by me on March 5th. The notary stamp on the version submitted by petitioner is dated March 7th in New York. I pulled another sheet from my folder. Exhibit C is my time off slip from my employer in Atlanta for March 5th. Exhibit D is my mother's medical record showing she was admitted to Grady Hospital that same week, which is where I was with her. And Exhibit E is my passport, showing no travel to New York in that period. I looked up at the judge. On the day this document claims I was in New York signing in front of a notary, I was in Georgia working a shift and taking my mama to the ER. The judge flipped between the pages, his frown deepening. Mr. Fields? He asked without looking up. Fields stood, trying to sound unbothered. There could be a simple explanation, Your Honor, a clerical error. So the notary made a clerical error about the city and date, the judge asked dryly, on a binding legal document? I didn't give them time to spin fairy tales. Exhibit F, I said, lifting the next set, is a printout of the document properties from the version of the prenup saved on my husband's computer. I obtained this when he asked me to email him a copy last year and he left the file open. It shows the agreement was modified on March 8th and March 10th, days after I signed by someone logged in as his uncle's user account. Fields took the papers from the bailiff, glanced at them, and I saw the moment the blood drained from his face. David shifted in his seat, a flicker of panic snapping across his features before he pasted his neutral mask back on. Modifications after signature aren't unusual, Fields tried. They can be formatting, clerical. Not when the modifications include adding a clause that waives spousal support entirely, I cut in, my tone still respectful but sharper now. That clause is not present in the copy I signed. It appears in the later version my husband has been waving in my face. I have both copies right here. I held them up, the one I'd been sent originally and the one his lawyer had attached to the motion. Even from the bench, the judge could see the extra paragraph at the bottom of page 6. He leaned forward. "Bring those here," he said. As the bailiff carried them up, I caught David's eye for the first time that morning. There was no amusement there now. Only that calculating look I knew from when deals were going sideways at his job. He was running numbers, odds, X's. For once, I was the variable he hadn't accounted for. Your Honor, I continued while the judge compared the pages, I am not claiming I didn't agree to any limitations. I am claiming that the agreement I signed did not contain all the language my husband is now trying to enforce. That I was not given independent legal advice and that I was not fully informed of his financial situation at the time. I pulled one last exhibit from my folder. My hands were steady now. Exhibit G is a transcription of a voicemail my husband left for a friend 3 months ago, which I later found saved in our cloud account. I read, letting his own words hang in the air. Man, I'm not worried. That prenup is locked. She signed it without even reading half of it. My uncle tightened it up after the wedding. No way she touches the business or the real money. She can cry all she wants. The court will just see a dumb housewife. The gasp that went through that courtroom was nothing like the polite murmurs from earlier. It was raw. One woman in the gallery actually said "wow" under her breath. The judge's gavel hit the wood hard. "Order," he barked. Fields was on his feet again, flustered. Your Honor, we question the authenticity of that transcription and its relevance. The relevance is clear, he snapped, eyes ice cold now. He looked straight at David. Mr. Carter approached the lectern. David rose slowly, like he was heading to his own execution. He shot me a look that mixed fury and fear. I could feel my knees wanting to wobble, but I anchored myself by wrapping my fingers around the edge of our table. Did you make a statement to the effect of what your wife just read? The judge asked. He licked his lips. People exaggerate in private conversations, Your Honor. It was locker room talk. This is not a football game, the judge cut him off. This is a court of law. Answer the question. Did you or did you not refer to your wife as a dumb housewife and state that your uncle tightened up the prenup after she signed it? Silence stretched. He glanced at Fields. The lawyer's face said in so many words, "You on your own." He may have said something like that jokingly, out of frustration. So the frustration was that your wife trusted you, I asked before I could stop myself. The judge shot me a warning look, but didn't reprimand me. If anything, his gaze towards David grew even colder. Mr. Fields, the judge said, turning back to the attorney, I'm sure you're familiar with, insert relevant Georgia case, the one about unconscionable agreements and lack of disclosure. Yes, Your Honor, Fields said tightly, because from where I'm sitting, based on what I've just heard and seen, enforcement of this agreement as written is very much in question. At minimum, there is sufficient evidence of potential fraud and overreach to deny your motion at this stage. We will not be using this prenuptial agreement as a shield to cut off Miss Carter's rights without a full trial on its validity. Hearing those words, deny your motion, I had to grip the table harder to keep my legs from giving out. This wasn't a win yet, not the whole war, but it was the first time since this started that someone with power wasn't treating that document like gospel. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, I am ordering a full forensic accounting of all marital assets and related business entities for the last 10 years. Any failure to disclose, any attempt to hide or transfer assets improperly will be viewed very unfavorably by this court. Fields sputtered. Your Honor, that's excessive. It's necessary, the judge said. When a spouse with greater financial knowledge refers to the other as dumb and admits to altering agreements post-signature, I cannot, in good conscience, take his disclosures at face value. He turned back to me. Miss Carter, for the purposes of today's hearing, the prenuptial agreement will not be enforced as a bar to your claims. We will proceed as though no valid agreement exists until we've had a chance to fully examine its formation and execution. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, I whispered, tears pricking my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from a kind of exhausted relief. I am also granting temporary support to maintain the status quo for the children and exclusive use of the marital residence to Miss Carter until further order. Mr. Carter, you may have reasonable visitation, but you will not remove the children from the jurisdiction. David started to protest, but the judge held up a hand. No more buts, Mr. Carter. Your wife came into this courtroom without counsel and presented a more coherent factual and legal argument than I have seen from some licensed attorneys. Perhaps you should have taken her intellect more seriously before today. The gallery chuckled softly at that, a sound that for once wasn't at my expense. As we shuffled our papers and the next case was called, a woman I didn't know touched my arm on the way out. I've never seen anything like that, she murmured. You were incredible. I wanted to tell her how scared I'd been, how this was just the first hill in a long mountain range. But all I said was, thank you, because for the first time in a long time, I believed it a little. Not that I was some TV-ready hero, but that the girl who had once wanted to stand in these rooms hadn't been foolish. She'd just been detoured. When I stepped into the hallway, David was there, jaw clenched, eyes stormy. You think this changes everything? You got lucky. You still gonna lose in the end. You can't beat me at my game. I slid my folder into my bag, met his glare with something closer to calm than I ever managed with him. I'm not playing your game, I said. I'm playing mine, and I just proved I know the rules better than you thought.
After that hearing, I wish I could say everything wrapped up neatly with a bow. It didn't. Court is not a movie. It's a slow grind. But the ground had shifted, and everybody in our orbit knew it, even if they pretended otherwise. The order for forensic accounting went out within a week. Subpoenas to banks, brokerage firms, even that one consulting company he'd mentioned once and never brought up again. For the first time in our marriage, people in suits were looking at his money the way he'd always looked at mine, line by line, with questions he couldn't wave away. At home, the atmosphere went from icy to hostile. He moved into the guest room until this is sorted, slamming doors a little harder than necessary. At dinner, he'd sigh loud enough for the kids to hear. Your wife thinks she's a lawyer now, he'd mutter. All this drama for what? A couple extra dollars she'll blow on nonsense. I stopped arguing with him in the kitchen. The judge's voice echoed in my head every time I wanted to snap back. Your wife presented a more coherent argument than some licensed attorneys. I held on to that like a lifeline. And I remembered what the black woman attorney I'd met had said. If the court invalidates this prenup or orders a forensic accounting, call me. So I did. Sitting in my car outside the courthouse after picking up a copy of the order, I dialed her number with hands that still smelled faintly of dish soap and printer ink. I heard about the hearing, she said before I could introduce myself. Word gets around. You did good. The judge ordered a forensic accounting, I told her. He denied their motion to enforce the prenup. He said we proceed like there wasn't one until we figured out if it was valid. I paused. I think I need help now. There was a beat. Then she said, come by my office tomorrow. We'll talk about how to make him pay for both of our time. Turning my case over to somebody else after carrying it alone for so long felt strange, like handing your newborn to a nurse for the first bath. But it was also a relief. I'd proved my point. I wasn't dumb, I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't gonna roll over. Now it was time for someone who knew all the traps I didn't to help me navigate the rest. She took the forensic accounting order and ran with it. When the numbers started coming back, even I was shocked. Offshore accounts, a loss-making business in his brother's name that had been quietly absorbing cash for years, real estate in another county I'd never heard of. All the places he told me we couldn't afford things, he'd been funneling our life into hiding spots. The accountant's report was brutal. My lawyer slid it across the table to me one afternoon, her red pen marks bleeding over his lies. She said, when you were at home clipping coupons, he was wiring 6 figures at a time to accounts you didn't even know existed. That's not just selfish. That's a breach of fiduciary duty. I repeated, fiduciary duty. That girl who'd once circled them in a textbook would have been proud. The next few hearings were less dramatic than that first gasp, but they were where the real rebuilding happened. The judge, seeing the pattern of concealment and manipulation, didn't just invalidate the prenup in the end. He wrote a detailed order explaining why. Lack of independent counsel, lack of full disclosure, evidence that material terms had been added post-signature without my knowledge.
The court will not reward a party who treats legal process as a game and his spouse's trust as a loophole to exploit, he wrote. The day my lawyer slid that order across the table, I cried in her office for a different reason. You did this, she said gently. If you had taken that first generous offer, he'd be toasting his victory in Turks and Caicos while you tried to figure out how to pay for braces and rent. With the prenup off the table, the divorce shifted to what should have been there from the start, a fair division of what we'd built. It still wasn't simple. Georgia isn't a community property state, and nothing about his mentality had changed overnight. He fought every valuation, claimed his business was nothing without him, tried to convince the court that my years at home had been her choice and therefore shouldn't count. But every time he tried to minimize me, the paper trail we'd unearthed made his arguments thinner. If she was so insignificant, my lawyer would ask, why did you go to such lengths to hide assets from her? In the final judgment, the court awarded me a significant share of marital assets, a portion of his retirement accounts, equity in the business, a buyout on the house so I could either sell and start fresh or stay without him hanging over it. Child support was set at a level that actually reflected his income, not the scrubbed version he tried to present. The judge also ordered him to pay the bulk of my attorney's fees, citing his obstructionist behavior and bad faith. Watching him sign that check, handshaking, was a small, quiet satisfaction. Not because I enjoyed his discomfort, but because for once, consequences flowed in the right direction. At home, the kids adjusted better than I'd feared. Children are resilient in ways adults rarely give them credit for. We talked, really talked. I didn't badmouth my father, but I didn't hide the truth either. Grown-up relationships are complicated, I told them at the kitchen table one night. Sometimes people you love do wrong things. That doesn't mean you have to pretend they're right to keep them happy. My son, the same one who'd asked me why I was being so mean to his father months earlier, looked down at his hands. He said you were trying to take everything, he said quietly, but he also said you weren't smart enough to understand his work. You were better than his lawyer in there. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. I wasn't better, I said. I was prepared. There's a difference. Don't confuse someone having more degrees with them being automatically right. And don't confuse loving someone with letting them be the only one who knows what's happening in your life. The night the decree became final, my best friend brought over a cheap bottle of sparkling wine and 2 plastic cups. We sat on the floor of my now peaceful living room. No more pacing, no more legal pads, no more tension hanging over everything like a cloud. And toasted, not to his absence, but to my presence. You really did it, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. You actually argued a motion and won. You made a judge quote case law back at them. I said, we still lost a lot. Time, illusions, the idea of what I thought marriage was. She clinked her cup against mine. Yeah, she said, but you didn't lose yourself. That counts for something. With the dust settling, I had to figure out who I was outside of being David's wife and the woman who represented herself in court. For the first time since I was 20, the idea of going back to school didn't feel like a fantasy anymore. I was older now, with kids and bills, but the voice that once said pre-law didn't sound so foolish anymore. I didn't run off and apply to law school the next day. Life doesn't work like that. But I did sign up for a paralegal certificate at the community college. Sitting in that classroom with 20-somethings and other non-traditionals, highlighting phrases in textbooks about contracts and evidence, felt like picking up a thread I dropped decades ago. I also started volunteering one night every month at the same legal aid clinic where I'd once sat trembling with my folder. I wasn't giving legal advice, I wasn't licensed, but I could sit with another woman while she tried to make sense of a wall of text and say, here's what I did. Here's the questions I wish I'd asked before I signed. I learned how to help people organize their documents so some overworked attorney could see at a glance what mattered instead of digging through chaos. In church parking lots and hair salons and school hallways, women started pulling me aside. They'd say, I heard what you did. My cousin is going through something similar. Can you talk to her? And I would. I told them the same thing every time. Representing yourself is not a game. It's not a TikTok challenge. It should be a last resort. But whether you have a lawyer or not, you have a right to understand the paper your life is being written on. On days when the check from the settlement hit my account, when I paid a bill in full or put a little aside for my children's future, it wasn't the money that made me proud. It was knowing that every dollar had come not from playing victim or staying quiet, but from refusing to let a man's arrogance and a rigged piece of paper dictate the story of my marriage's end. The resolution of the case didn't fix the hurt between David and me. I don't think anything ever will completely, but it did set a different kind of example for our children, one where they
saw their mother stand up in a room that wasn't built for her and speak in a voice she'd been told was too emotional, too naive, too dumb for serious things, and watched that voice move a judge to see her as more than a stereotype. In the years since, whenever I've had to advocate for myself in a doctor's office, at a parent-teacher meeting, at a bank, I think back to that day in courtroom 4B, to the sound of his laugh, to the look on his face when the judge said, "Perhaps you should have taken her intellect more seriously." And I remind myself, I don't need anyone else in a suit beside me to give me permission to be taken seriously. I earned that by doing the scariest thing I've ever done, opening my mouth when the whole room expected me to stay in my place.
For a long time, I told myself that door had closed and I'd missed my chance. Law school was a nice dream, I think, while packing lunches or wiping counters. Real life chose you. I let one detour, a semester where my mama's illness mattered more than my credits, turn into a verdict on what I was allowed to be in every room afterward. It made it easier to swallow being talked over, easier to laugh when David joked that I couldn't handle his work, easier to hand him the paperwork and say, "You deal with it," even when something in my gut whispered, "You should read that." The thing about that courtroom day that everyone remembers is the gasp, that sharp inhale when I said the prenup was forged, when his own words about his dumb housewife echoed through the speakers. People love that moment because it feels like justice in a single beat. But the real takeaway for me isn't the gasp. It's the year of nights at my kitchen table that came before it. It's the realization that the version of me who survived that process wasn't the law school girl I thought I should have been, or the broken woman I was afraid I had become. She was something in between, tired and terrified and still willing to learn. Representing yourself is not glamorous. It is not a flex. It's a last resort that can chew you up if you're not careful. I would never tell another woman, just do what I did like it's some recipe you can follow between dinner and bedtime. What I will say is this: whether you ever set foot in a courtroom or not, you owe it to yourself to stop treating the documents that shape your life like suggestions written in another language. Ask questions before you sign. Get copies. Keep them. Don't let anybody, spouse, uncle, pastor, family lawyer, shame you out of saying, "I don't understand this. Explain it." That's not distrust. That's stewardship of your own future. I also had to face an uncomfortable truth. I wasn't just afraid of losing the case. I was afraid of looking stupid. Afraid of proving everyone right who'd ever said I was too emotional or too dramatic. So I stayed quiet longer than I should have, nodded along to things I didn't agree with, and called it compromise. That silence didn't protect me. It protected the story David was telling about me, that I wouldn't fight back, that I didn't know how. The day I walked into that courtroom with my blue folder and my heart lodged in my throat, I didn't suddenly become fearless. I was scared the whole time. The difference was I stopped confusing fear with incapacity. I did it scared. I cried in the bathroom between hearings, then went back in and asked the next question. I shook when I cross-examined him, but I kept my voice steady because the judge didn't need my tears to rule. He needed my facts. If you've ever been told you're too much to be taken seriously or not enough to matter in big decisions, hear me. Those phrases are tools. They keep people like you on the sidelines while their names go on the dotted lines. You don't have to become an expert overnight to refuse that role. Start where you are. Read the lease. Read the prenup. Read the student loan terms. Ask the HR rep to explain the benefit package. Sit in on the parent-teacher conference with notes instead of just nodding and leaving. If you can't afford a lawyer right now, see if your city has a legal aid clinic. Use the library. Watch reputable explainers online. Does that replace professional representation? No, but it does mean the next time someone shoves a paper at you and says, "Everyone signs this, don't worry about it," you recognize enough red flags to hit pause. One of the most powerful shifts for me was giving up the idea that avoiding conflict is the same as preserving peace. I stayed quiet about a lot of little things in my marriage because I thought that's what good wives do, what good black women do: smooth things over, keep the family from falling apart. All that quiet did was give him a blueprint of how far he could go without me pushing back. He took my conflict avoidance as consent. When I finally did draw a line, he was shocked, not because what I was asking for was unreasonable, but because he'd built a whole identity on the belief that I would never ever make waves that might rock his boat. The court didn't gasp because I'm special. They gasped because arrogance always sounds the same right before it trips. She's dumb. She signed without reading. She can't do anything. All I did was tug on the thread he'd been so sure I'd never touch. The paper unraveled itself. Maybe the most important part of this whole mess is what it taught my kids. They watched their father's narrative shift from "Mom is trying to ruin me" to "Dad hid things and is facing consequences." They saw me raise my voice without losing my humanity. They saw a judge treat me with respect I hadn't even been given myself. Now when my daughter says, "I'm not signing anything until I've read it," I don't snap, "Don't be difficult." I say, "Good. Do you need help reading it?" When my son jokes about breadwinners and housewives, I raise an eyebrow and ask, "And who raised you? Who walked into court and made sure you still had a roof?" He laughs and says, "You did, Mom," but I make sure he hears the seriousness under it. The emotional takeaway for me is simple and hard at the same time. Your voice will not always make people comfortable. It won't always win the day. But keeping it caged to make other people feel big does not protect you. It erases you. That's the real loss. Money comes and goes. Houses can be bought, sold, rebuilt.
Degrees can be earned later in life. Your sense that you are allowed to say this is not right in a room full of people who prefer you didn't, once that's gone, it's a lot harder to get back. I'm not grateful for what David did. I'm not thankful for the pain. I am, however, grateful that when the moment came and the judge looked at me and said, "Miss Carter," I chose to open my mouth and speak as the woman I have been trying to not need for 20 years, the one who knows better than to bet against herself just because someone else is laughing.